All right. Hey, man, how you going?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Doing all right. Welcome to another OTXNT. Glad to be hanging out with you. Got an interesting topic today, divorce. It's going to be, I asked you to do this one with me because I've been preaching through the Gospel of Matthew, and here we are, Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32. Jesus talks about divorce. And so I wanted to kind of get your take on that, have a discussion. I don't know about you, but I think like this is going to be kind of a three-parter in that I think we'll be talking about divorce today. I think we'll talk about some implications in our next video of marriage. And then what do we do about for those who have been divorced, and how do we get, what does remarriage look like too? So I feel like this is going to be a three-parter, man. You up for it?
I'm up for it. I mean, this is an important thing to get right and to handle with great care because it affects a lot of Christians. So, yeah.
All right, dude. Well, then you want to start us off?
Let's go ahead and pray. Please join me. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So this is your baby. I'll let you drive.
All right. So here's the deal. So I started this past week. I got to Matthew 5. Let me pull it up. And you get into verse 31 and verse 32. And here's what Jesus says. He says, "It was said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a written notice of divorce. But I tell you, everyone who divorces his wife, except in the case of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." So that was my passage. And okay, so here is, in a nutshell, kind of where I fall on this, right? I think there's a lot that hinges on what does the word sexual immorality mean, right? So behind that is you being a Greek guy, porneia, and I know that is it's a fairly broad word, and it's different. It's not the same word that Jesus used in the passage right before for adultery. So I guess that's the first thing I want to deal with, right? Is it seems like, right, and I know that you and I have to kind of go through these opinions. It does seem like what Jesus is saying, and kind of where I land is that there is a reason, a legitimate reason for when a divorce can happen. He's giving that reason right there, right? That he's quoting Deuteronomy 24, where Moses is saying, hey, if there, and I'll just, so I don't butcher that one, Deuteronomy 24 says, if a man marries a woman, but she becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, he may write her a divorce certificate and hand it to her and send her away from his house. And a lot kind of centers on what does that word indecent mean as well. And I know during Jesus' time, there's the debates, right, about kind of the two schools. One is an anything goes. You know, if she burns your food, get rid of her. And there was another that kind of said it's adultery only. They were kind of debating what did Moses mean by what is indecent. I actually think that's what Jesus is clarifying for us here. He's been doing that in context. He's clarifying what was the original intent of the law. And I think what Jesus is saying is the reason for why you should have a divorce, if any, if there ever would be a divorce, would be, and he says, in case of porneia, or as we English translations would say, immorality. So I think that Jesus is clarifying what indecent means there, and I think he's giving the one reason that would be allowed for divorce. Now, there's a second that Paul gives us in 1 Corinthians 7 that we can deal with, but I want to deal with, at least in this scenario right now, about that. So where do you land? What do you kind of think about this so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's not a lot of passages to work through, but I think for most Christians, as you start working through these passages, you might be surprised at how rigid Jesus's answer appears. And in fact, you just talked about the most lenient passage that we can find on Jesus's view of divorce, because when we find it in Mark, Matthew 19, Luke 16, that exception clause isn't even there. It basically is very much no. And so, I've got the Mark passage. Let me pull that one up here. Mark 10, verse, let's go with 2. The Pharisees came and asked him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" testing him. And he answered to them, saying, "What did Moses command you?" "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her." And Jesus says, "This is because of the hardness of your heart. He wrote this precept, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate." And so, moving on, the disciples ask him, and he says, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if a woman divorces her husband, and marries another, she commits adultery." And that's the end of the story. And so that exception clause is not in the Markan passage, and I don't believe it's in the Lucan passage.
It's not in Luke as well. It's the exceptions are only in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19.
Yes, and so the big question, that some have looked at with what is being done with this pornea question is, Jesus is either using that as an exception that is very specific, or using it as, I guess there's 3 options. It's very precise, meaning fornication in that sense, very broad, or just replicating adultery as adultery is used in other places. But the other option is pornea being an all-encompassing sexual immorality type phrase. The problem I have with that use of it is that it kind of becomes a back door to just about any reason that you want to be divorced. You can attach onto pornea in some very broad sense. And so that is where I get nervous about expanding pornea to be a very broad term, but that is a common thing to do in Protestant.
And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, that's what essentially is happening is people are asking him about, especially in 19, can we divorce for any reason? And he's saying, no, you can't. But essentially, if we're not honest with the text, if we make it mean more, then essentially we're backdoor having it mean anything that we want it to mean, and we've gone back to the problem that we were just at.
So when I was in seminary, it was the 3 A's. So that the Bible gives you permission to divorce for adultery, abuse, and abandonment. And that is generally an attempt to pull together the passages in the Gospels and in 1 Corinthians and see a broader picture of how this might work. And so the real question, which of course is a later discussion, is the question of remarriage, because that's where it really bites a lot of Christians down the road. But in terms of just permitting divorce, do you have to see all 3 of those aspects in the concept of sexual immorality, or do you see Paul providing a broader understanding of what is permissible now that the church is in existence? So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So here's the one thing I think is kind of when I was studying this last week, one of the things that troubled me a little bit is people said, well, Jesus is not meaning to give all the reasons in which divorce is permissible. He's just talking about this case here in terms of on the immorality piece. And I get a little nervous with that, because then I think what that does is, once again, you're opening up the opportunity for, okay, well, what other things is he not addressing? And I think he's very specific here for a reason, right? I do think what Paul offers in 1 Corinthians is he's talking to church people now. And I think the standard that he's giving for church people is, he's not Jesus' standard still is with us, but one of now the unique pieces is, and that's the piece on the abandonment piece I want to look at too, is the abandonment is primarily about an unbeliever abandoning a believer.
Right.
And so that's the unique scenario of 2 people who were unsaved, were married, one of them becomes a Christian. Now somebody wants out because he doesn't want to be with that crazy Jesus person anymore. And that's the scenario saying, let it go. It's okay. But if they're willing to stay with you, stay with them, right?
Right.
And so I think that's a unique scenario. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is this is Jesus showing this is what he wants from his followers. And so I think Paul is bringing in that thing about what happens with unbelievers. And when that's added into the equation as well, when one doesn't hold to the same thing and one doesn't want it. So that to me is a big thing. The issue that also is a big deal is immorality, how you define porneia. Like if you do a search, and I guess, help me out here. When I'm teaching through this stuff, I usually want to look at the words that they use and see how was that word used in the Septuagint. Because if they're quoting Septuagint, I want to know, but I also want to know, how did the Septuagint use that word? What's the world view of the text that maybe they've got? If you look at that word porneia in the Septuagint, it's used of like harlotry, it's used of unfaithfulness. That's the big thing, is it's used in terms of prostitution, that kind of a thing, unfaithfulness. And so it does appear that that seems to be what is the case. I keep in mind what Jesus just talked about right before, which is adultery and adultery of the heart. And so part of me wonders whether he chooses a different word because of what he just taught about in the section prior, that he's saying that this is a little bit bigger than just simply I committed the act of adultery, but he uses that word to be a little more all-encompassing, to say that there are things that you and I do that are adulterous. And I think if the person remains persistent in those adulterous behaviors, I'm lenient in that, but I'm not. But I understand there can get very slippery very quickly depending on how you do it. And I'm trying to remember who was it that I read. Maybe it was Piper or Grudem that I read on this. It was talking about the importance of the local church to help you decipher what that is, right? About like whether or not this is a legitimate understanding of, yes, this is repeated unfaithfulness and would fall under that or not. So that's kind of where I'm at. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so, John Piper's got a pretty well thought article on where his church landed on this issue. And of course, he defines porneia very specifically in reference to fornication, and argues that the reason Matthew is careful to put that exception clause in is because he's got the instance of Joseph and Mary, that Joseph was going to put Mary away because it appeared that she had committed porneia, that she had had a fornication relationship, and thus Jesus is on the way. And of course, the accusation made against Jesus is, is he not a child of porneia? And so Matthew is kind of defending Joseph, that they had not actually come together. And so this would almost be an annulment rather than an actual marriage, in the sense that they had consummated this marriage. And in that case, that's such a restricted approach that there really is no grounds for Christian divorce once you have actually been married and consummated the wedding. And so that, I think, is a very challenging viewpoint. And I've got to say that his exegesis is pretty tight from my perspective on that. However, that's not usually how it's been understood. That there have been general concessions for adultery being grounds for divorce. But for most of church history, that did not constitute grounds for remarriage. And that's another big question, because the passage in Matthew continues on, well, Jesus, if we can't remarry, or what you're presenting to us makes marriage seem it's better not to get married. And Jesus,
that's the Matthew 19. Yeah. Why would anyone want to get married then if you can't cut this off, right?
If there's no real grounds for divorce and then a second attempt at marriage down the road, then why get married at all? And Jesus doesn't say, well, you're right, let me clarify. No, he says, this is a hard truth, and you're right. It's a hard truth. You need God's help. And so, that's something I think that because divorce has become so commonplace in our culture, we don't wrestle through Jesus's very restrictive position. And again, if it's Jesus's position, it should be ours. So I would be content, to be honest, if Christians today would limit divorce to adultery or limit divorce because if they would just do that, I would be happy because it would limit the number of divorces that we have.
Yeah. So really quickly, when I read Piper's article, I was swayed a little bit because I do feel like that could be the sense. To me, it's one of two. I think he makes a good argument because I think what Jesus is doing is clarifying Moses. And what Moses seems to be clarifying is that the possibility of right after you get married and you realize I've had somebody who's been fooling around on me the whole time, that seems to be either Moses is saying somebody who's been fooling around prior to your marriage because, it's been put together and you don't know the kind of person that was or anything like that. We read into it the way that we approach marriage today. It was not hey, I like you, you like me. Right. It's like you've been promised to me and our families have gotten to this agreement, but you've been a sleaze all the way up to this point, right? And so there's that possibility, or I think another, based on at least the word choice, is this is somebody who after you've gotten married is out and about, right? And so I do think that there's a place to be lenient in that because it seems like it can go both ways in that. And I think you can be honest and open with the text like that. But to me, it has to be, I do think you have to read it in light of the previous section, which is we're talking about adultery. We're talking about immorality in our marriage. And I think that that should scare some people about your actions. Oh, it's okay. What I'm not really doing is hurting my wife or my spouse. I'm just, and I don't need to change these things. Like, no, I think you should, because that's a pretty serious thing you're doing. But I do think it's interesting when you start to look at stats on why people get divorced. And I showed this to my congregation. Let's see if I can throw open those stats while I'm at it. You would not believe that the number one stat for why people get divorced, this is the first one. The number one is lack of commitment. This is the largest reason why people get divorced in America today. And it's because we're just not in love anymore. Yeah. I don't feel that tingly sensation like I used to when we were together. The next one is argue too much. The one right after that, which is kind of close to it, these are the percentages. Like 73% say it was lack of commitment. 56 say argue too much. 55 say infidelity. Another group says, another top reason is, are we married too young? Another after that is unrealistic expectations, lack of equality, unprepared for a marriage. And then at the very bottom is abuse. 25%. Like the bigger reasons are we just don't love each other anymore. So you're absolutely right. If we would just say, limit it to just one thing, because as a Christian, no, I'm sorry, you go.
Well, and that goes, again, back to the Corinthian passage. Paul's instructions don't contradict Jesus's. Basically, as it's up to you, try your best to stay married. Really, that is kind of the view here. And don't commit adultery. But if someone commits adultery, that may or may not be a cause for divorce, depending on how you understand that word porneia. But the Paul passage is, if you have been dismissed because your spouse doesn't want to be with you, you don't have to somehow pursue legal recourse or keep pushing in order to stay together. You can consent to be divorced because of what they've done, but you're not supposed to seek it yourself. And so really, the Christian's goal is to keep the marriage together as much as they are able. And that is because, we believe once saved, always saved. Aren't we glad that God doesn't fall out of love with us? Because that picture of marriage is a picture of salvation and God's joining to his church. And so, when we distort that image, we distort the salvation that we're promised in Christ. But the other issue is that there's a sensitive topic here, and that is abuse, because there's a lot of people who are saying that because the church has taught that that's not a valid reason for divorce, that we have kind of set women up to be abused by not giving them recourse. And so I do think that we need to address that. And Russell Moore actually had a tweet that says, in my view, divorce is ethical based on sexual immorality or abandonment, and he sees abuse as an unsafe home, which constitutes abandonment. And I think that that's where I would put it as well, that there is a place for those that are in an abusive relationship to kind of view, rather than their husband just abandoning them, he's actually gotten abusive. And so I believe the Christian response there, though, should be separation, and with the prayer and hope that God could still do a work. But there is grounds to get safe, to be separated and divorce. And I think that grounds, though, needs to really be weighed with the remarriage question. I think we'll have to address that.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is where this leaves off for you and I right now, is our next discussion has to be on implications for marriage based on this passage, right? So if Jesus only gives one reason, and it's debated whether that meant, like you're saying, is it, the Piper position is actually, was it meant to be like fooling around right prior to marriage, and this was never meant to be? And so kind of a context that's completely unlike our own today, because we're not in arranged marriages or things like that. Or is it for the reasons of immorality? I think that's something that we need to then talk about, which is why. What does marriage need to look like? Why is it so important that marriage remain at whatever cost? And where we're saying that even like, don't jump to, like, Jesus is not commanding get divorced. He's not. He's giving an exception. Even Moses was not commanding. They said he commanded us to give it, in the sense that he allowed for that. But so we need to talk about, why is it so important to stay together? And I think that that's something that we should probably deal with in the next. And then also the idea of, okay, so what do I do? What do we do if we've got somebody who's divorced and they want to get remarried, right? What is the biblical position on that? Or maybe they're divorced and they're already remarried.
Right.
What is the biblical position on that? And so we need to deal with those necessarily, but let's do that for another time in the next one.
So do you agree, though, abandonment, abuse, adultery are grounds for divorce? Or
those would be... So, yeah, I mean, it comes down to is on abuse. Is abuse in 1 Corinthians 7? And I know that I think Wayne Grudem has said, I know that based on word choice of Paul, he believes that that's part of the interpretation of what that is, that it's there. And so, I think that that's a little, but here's the thing, I don't want to make that one broad either. And so I do think that, what we should say right now is some of this gets murky. And I think having you and your situation and your church people kind of evaluate that, your leaders to look at that with you, I think is important to do. Here's what I don't want to do. I don't want to go beyond what is in the text. Right. And so that's why I think, on some of those, separation is first and foremost, probably what you're going to want to do before you even jump to that. But yeah, I think I'd like to look a little bit more on that and read a little bit more on the 1 Corinthians 7, because at least I don't see abuse in the porneia. I see that as breaking the marital bond, unfaithfulness in your marriage vows. Paul's scenario is something I need to look at a little bit more, and I'd be up for actually, if you want to do the next one as what's Paul saying in 1 Corinthians 7, if you want to do that first.
Yeah, I think that might be a sounding board, but just because of the climate we're in, if you are in an abusive relationship, we want you to get safe, all right? And we don't want you to endure abuse of any kind. Get safe, and
There
then
are no verses say stay up and put up with it. Get out. Get the heck out as quickly as possible.
Right. And seek guidance, seek counsel, seek protection, and there is a spiritual avenue that will be made apparent, through prayer. But that, just we're in a position. I don't want anyone to think that we are piling on that because of just the climate. So get safe. And I do think that that's a good place to launch, but I think we're out of time. Are we?
We are. So this is good. Let's deal with this. Let's get in the next one, and I'll write it down for our next video. Let's deal with abuse and 1 Corinthians 7. We got to deal with the other passage because one exception in Matthew 5. Let's deal with 1 Corinthians 7, and then we'll talk about implications of that. But I think you're absolutely right. We gotta take a little more time on that for sure. And so yeah, let's deal with it next. Stick around, listen for the next one as it drops next week, and we'll continue on. Our goal in all of this is just to try to figure out what did Jesus teach on this? What's the Bible, and not what do I think? What's my view, right? I'm trying to get my view. I hope is trying to find what Jesus's view was, and mold my view to his opinions and his teachings of that. So there you go. All right, man. You want to do our Lord's Prayer now?
Let's do it. All
right.
You giving the blessing.
That's right. You did the Lord's Prayer. I'm doing the blessings. So thank you for the reminder of these things. May the Lord bless you and protect you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord look with favor on you and give you peace. Guys, thanks for watching or listening, and we will talk to you next week. Take care.
Take care.